Tonight on CBC Vancouver News.
And I think we should have them be accountable.
The path to healing and the urgent plea from local First Nations. Also,
we need to find the person who did this and bring justice for Trina.
Desperate for answers, a reward for information from the family of a slain Port Moody woman. And
forests on public lands belong to the people of BC. They belong to the Indigenous communities where they're growing.
Boosting Indigenous participation as BC looks to modernize its forestry plan.
This is CBC Vancouver News.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Calls are mounting for the Roman Catholic Church to take greater responsibility for its role in the residential school system. The urgent pleas come after the Kamloops First Nation announcing it had discovered the remains of 215 children at a site near Kamloops. As John Hernandez reports, Indigenous and faith leaders say an apology is the first step toward healing.
Carmen Lansdowne spent the last few days grieving at home alone. This is the first time she's taking in the sights of this residential school memorial in Vancouver.
I have flashes of anger and frustration combined with grief and sadness and numbness.
Lansdowne is an Indigenous ordained minister at the First United Church, a ministry based in the city's downtown east side, where the impact of Canada's residential school system is seen daily.
You can't be in the downtown east side without noticing the really stark racialization of Indigenous poverty and homelessness and addiction. And so much of that is the impacts of generations of colonialism, including the residential school.
The United Church of Canada has apologized for its role running residential schools in Canada. So too have Anglican and Presbyterian churches. But Indigenous advocates say the Roman Catholic Church has yet to issue a fulsome or satisfying apology for running as many as 70% of Canada's residential schools.
As an Indigenous ordained minister, it is deeply painful to see ecumenical partners not do that work.
A full-throated apology is one of many recommendations in Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a call to action that's been compounded by the discovery of the 215 child remains at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School.
They have caused the greatest harm in many of our communities. I will say that it's just about acknowledging that harm.
Angela White leads a society of survivors who want to see the Pope address the Kamloops tragedy along with concrete action to go with the apology, including outreach.
We should have them be accountable to providing resources, whether it's money or counseling, for the damage that they've done so that the healing can continue.
A road to healing and forgiveness that's long and hard. A journey that starts with an apology. John Hernandez, CBC News, Vancouver.
The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Perry Bellegarde, is calling on provinces to do everything they can to hold perpetrators accountable for the actions. Premier John Horgan says the province is working to those ends.
The province of British Columbia stands ready to implement all of the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We put that not just in the mandate letters of the Minister of Indigenous Relations, but every minister of government. This is the future of British Columbia to make up for our past, and I think that we will be stronger as a result of that.
Horgan says BC will help when called upon. That story can bring back traumatic memories or feelings of loss, sadness, or anger. And we want to tell you there is help available. You can reach the 24-hour Indian Residential School Survivors Society crisis line at 1-866-925-4419. The KUAS crisis line is another option. For adults, the number is 250-723-4050, and youth can call 250-723-2040. That information is also available on our website, cbc.ca/BC. The family of a woman found dead after vanishing from her Port Moody home is hoping a reward will help find her killer. The remains of Trina Hunt were found 2 months after she disappeared. Dan Burrett joins us with more. Dan, an emotional plea today How much is this reward?
Up to $50,000, Anita. Trina Hunt's family says the pain of her death is unbearable. The 48-year-old was reported missing on January 18th. Her husband called 911 saying he'd last seen her as he left their Port Moody house. That sparked family and friends to look for her for a month, combing nearby woods and trails. Then in late March, her remains were found near the Silver Creek area in Hope. Police say she'd been in that area the weekend of January 15th. Now, Hunt's family is pleading for anyone with information to contact police, and they have a message for her killer or killers.
We know you're out there, and our family and our community will continue fighting for answers. And while painfully nothing will bring back our Trina, we will get justice for Trina. We promise.
Homicide investigators say their case is progressing, but they aren't sharing many details, including on any people of interest. RCMP also won't say if Hunt traveled to Hope on her own or with someone, nor what car she might have used.
If doing the right thing isn't enough for you, now you have a very lucrative incentive of $50,000 money, a lot of money put up by the family for you to come forward and share that information.
IHID and Port Moody police are now working together on Hunt's case. Anita?
Thank you, Dan. The province is announcing a modernizing of BC's forestry plan. It's one that sees more First Nations participation. Tanya Fletcher joins us with details on what it involves. Tanya, this marks a big policy shift, so how will it change the sector?
Yeah, the province has set in motion a series of goals and plans to update its regulation of the forest sector. And it gives government the power to redistribute tenures to Indigenous operators and smaller companies. So currently 5 large companies hold roughly half of the forest tenures in BC. And this plan outlines a specific target of increasing the tenures held by Indigenous peoples to 20% from the current 10%. Premier John Horgan says his government has been foreshadowing change, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to industry.
The tenure system has been developed and evolved over decades and is not meeting the needs of communities. It's not meeting the needs of workers, and quite frankly, it's not meeting the needs of other players in the sector who want access to more fiber to create more jobs, more value-added products.
A framework will outline how tenure holders will get compensation for lost harvesting rights, and consultations overall are set to begin later this month, with legislation to be introduced in the fall.
So very much a focus on the future. Did it address anything specific to old growth logging and the protests at Fairy Creek right now?
Well, not directly, no. New plans for old growth won't be in place until 2023. And keep in mind, this is a long-term policy outlook that's been in the works long before the current conflict flared up. John Horgan was asked, though, about the pressure mounting on the province to answer the calls from advocates. Many of the protesters were looking to this announcement today with hopes that it would chart a path forward with concrete solutions to better preserve old trees. Well, the Premier said his government has already committed to implementing all of the recommendations that came from an independent review.
And the critical recommendation that's at play at Fairy Creek is consulting with the title holders, the people whose land these forests are growing on, and those consultations have to take place. If we were to arbitrarily put deferrals in place there, that would be a return to the colonialism that we have so graphically been brought back to as a result of issues in Kamloops this week.
The BC Greens responded with a scathing statement as well, saying, quote, to release an intentions paper without any concrete actions to protect ancient forests today is nothing more than a stalling tactic and a recipe for further conflict in our forests. Anita?
All right, thanks, Tanya. Now, reaction to the lack of details regarding old growth has been swift. As Tanya mentioned, protesters were hopeful. Our Kieran Odzorn was at the Fairy Creek old growth logging site today as they learned of the plan with some disappointment.
So camps in the Fairy Creek area continue to expand. This camp is actually a relatively new one, and it's well up in the hills. And on sunny days like this, it's pretty easy living up here. People are buzzing around, doing their chores, chopping wood, and trying to stay ready. And ready for what? Well, today we saw police helicopters come and buzz this camp. There's a lot of that going on here and elsewhere as tensions remain high.
What we're doing here, I hope, together as a community is we'll create bridges for real communication to happen.
So up on the ridge, people are continuing to hold the line, but down here, people are waiting to hear what the Premier has to say. We're going to be listening in as people read out the statement.
More detailed information on the status of old growth condition and trends in compliant with existing targets are in development through the Forest and Range Evaluation Program. More information will be released this summer and fall. Defer, defer, defer.
His logging cohorts are now pressing for time and pressing and increasing their volume of logging to get what they want, and then they likely, again, like I say, let's talk now when there's nothing left.
They know we're here, but they're kind of ignoring it. So hopefully, you know, the more people that come and speak up and stand up, the more obvious it is that they're making fools of themselves, ignoring this situation.
So as we heard of the reaction from Bill Jones and Rainbow Eyes there was no mention of Fairy Creek in this announcement, and conversations about deferment for more old growth seem to be being put off until later, deferred in fact, and that leaves people here at the camp pretty underwhelmed. Kieran Alzern, CBC News, near Port Renfrew.
Ottawa has given the green light to allow a shot of AstraZeneca to be followed up by an mRNA vaccine like Pfizer and Moderna. Now, BC will detail its plan on mixed dosing later this week. Vicadopia shows us how mixing and matching could give Canada a real edge in the race to immunize.
For Canadians waiting for their second shot of AstraZeneca, there could soon be another choice. Anyone who's had AstraZeneca will be able to get either mRNA vaccine booster, and those two vaccines can be swapped with each other for their second dose.
The interchangeability of vaccines means that you can receive one vaccine product for your first dose and safely receive a different vaccine for your second dose to complete your two-dose vaccine series for optimal protection from COVID-19.
Officials say their decision is supported by a preliminary mix and match study from Spain. People who got a Pfizer shot after AstraZeneca had double the immune response than those who got two AstraZeneca shots.
I think it's a very wonderful news all around. It appears this mix and vaccine strategy works out pretty well if you were to only look at the levels of neutralizing antibodies against the spike protein.
Other research from the UK shows people who first had AstraZeneca, followed by a Pfizer shot, were more likely to have mild symptoms, such as fever and chills, but no increased risk of rare blood clots.
And then, of course, there's real-world experience in places like France and Germany that have been doing this for months as well. And so this certainly wouldn't be a first if it's done in Canada. If it's deemed to be safe and effective, I think it's a very reasonable thing to do.
Other provinces are also now considering allowing mixing, but no decision has been made. It's no relief for those who've had AstraZeneca and are waiting to find out what their second shot will be.
I know the whole risk analysis, I understand that, but I just wish everyone could have had Pfizer and been able to wait for it.
More options to be fully vaccinated, which can't come soon enough. Vicadopia, CBC News, Toronto.
BC has hit a new milestone in its fight against COVID-19. More than 70% of all adults have received at least one dose of the vaccine. A record high 11,000 people received a second dose of the COVID shot yesterday. There are 184 new cases of the virus, the lowest case count since October, and no new deaths to report tonight. Well, it was a heck of a party, and one that was set to make one man a lot of money, despite the fact that it broke BC's COVID rules. Now, our Jason Proctor is looking at new court documents. They show the man who pleaded guilty after throwing his downtown Vancouver penthouse party knew he was in the wrong and was covering his tracks.
At the time Mohamed Movasaji became the first person in BC to be sentenced in criminal court for violating COVID-19 restrictions, the judge told him he was lucky to be getting just 1 day in jail. The judge said if somebody got sick at his party of COVID-19 and died, as far as she was concerned, he would be guilty of manslaughter. A lawsuit filed by BC's Director of Civil Forfeiture suggests the judge wasn't the only one to think about the question of liability when it comes to the virus. Police allegedly seized a stack of waivers from Movasagi's home, with guests acknowledging the contagious nature of COVID-19 and the risk that they might die if they caught it. The Director of Civil Forfeiture wants to keep $8,740 the police seized from a safe in the apartment. According to the court documents, the money is the proceeds of unlawful activity, which includes breaking Public Health Act orders prohibiting gatherings. Police found 78 people in Movasagi's suite, along with a makeshift bar, a stripper pole, and a topless dancer. Police also allegedly identified a number of people associated with organized crime. The lawsuit claims patrons at the party were handed receipts for drinks issued by a cleaning company controlled by Movasagi. His girlfriend is also named in the suit. Movasagi has not filed a response to the claim, but the court documents say he has indicated his intention to claim the money. Jason Proctor, CBC News, Vancouver.
Let's go now to the other important health crisis unfolding in the province. BC just had its worst ever month of April for overdose deaths from toxic drugs. 176 people died in April, an average of 6 people per day. That's pushing the total death for 2021 to 680. 79% of those who died this year were men, and fentanyl was detected in the vast majority of deaths. BC's Minister of Mental Health and Addictions addressed the topic at the legislature this morning.
The illicit street drug supply is increasingly toxic, and that is something borne out in the coroner's reports, and that more people are staying home using alone is also has led to a terrible surge in overdose deaths. And to those who have lost loved ones, family members, team members, I'm so sorry.
The month of April was also the 14th straight month in which more than 100 people died of suspected overdose in BC. Johanna Wagstaffe joins us now with the forecast. Your background says it all. Oh, love this heat wave.
I am loving it too, Anita. Yeah, I know the humidity's not for everyone, but it really is just a mini dip into hot, humid, and sunny weather. Tomorrow is very similar to today, if you've loved it. Let me show you the current temperatures out there right now. We are breaking a few records, nothing of note across Metro Vancouver. 23 for YVR right now, which is pretty high for this time of the year. I mean, it's June 1st, which is the official meteorological start to summer. We go June, July, August. It keeps track of trends and records a little easier. So I'm full on summer over here is what I'm saying. Take a look at the afternoon humidex, up to the high 20s across Metro Vancouver. Inland, feeling like the low 30s. And we really felt that switch today. I know it's been muggy the past couple of days, but today the all blue skies and high temperatures, thanks to the fact that we're now starting to get an outflow. So that high pressure shifting to inland sections, we're getting that air moving from the interior towards the coast. Still getting a lot of rain for central and northern coastal sections. That's who's taking the brunt of it. And I just want to show you one more trend as I take you through the next 24 hours. Look at these overnight temperatures. So things are a little sticky through the overnight, over the next couple of nights. Dare I even say, get out the fan and open the windows, Anita, but it's short-lived. I'll tell you when the rain comes coming up.
All right, thanks, Joe.
You're welcome.
Well, the Sea to Sky gondola is set to reopen on June 11th after the cable was cut for the second time 8 months ago. The gondola cable was first cut in August of 2019, then fixed, but cut again a year later in September of 2020. There have been no arrests for either incident. Operators say security will be beefed up to avoid a third cable cutting. That includes an in-house security team and 24-hour surveillance of all infrastructure. Well, Surrey has approved plans to build a road through Bear Creek Park. The contentious road would cut through the park to help ease congestion through Surrey. Mayor Doug McCallum believes there is overwhelming community support for the plan, but the vote went through with a narrow 5-4 margin. Councillors against the plan say more consultation was needed before cutting through the park. And June is Filipino Heritage Month, and with BC being home to the second largest Filipino community in Canada, we here at the CBC are celebrating with stories about BC Filipinos. We spoke with two sisters in Vancouver who are tackling difficult topics like body shaming, colorism, and language on their podcast, Filipino Fridays.
Most of these issues that have been highlighted now, we're getting from people who not only are diasporic Filipinos, or, maybe people who have, just naturally grown and changed body types through the years. Yeah. And then now you get this immediate reaction from somebody, commenting on their body, and it is very harmful and dangerous because it then would affect their mental health.
And it takes a toll because then you tie that into body dysmorphia, which is huge, especially with women. And I know men as well go through that go through that as well, but it's just like it's toxic. It just needs to stop.
So the beauty standard for Filipinos is usually a lighter complexion with a narrower nose, which is opposite from what our native facial structure and characteristics are.
Indigenous Filipinos are much darker, much more into, they have that distinguished Filipino nose, quote unquote.
Yeah, and that's, again, with the admiration for our colonizers, whether it was American, whether it was Japanese, whether it was,
what else?
Spaniards, right? That is, when you have those qualities, that means that you are of a higher social standing, which then the Filipinos aspire to. But then now, through the centuries, that standard, that outdated standard has now impacted how we look at ourselves and how we accept, each other. And that also needs to change.
You can hear more from those women and their podcast online. It's part of Mabuhay BC, a series dedicated to telling Filipino stories across British Columbia. And a reminder, you can watch this newscast live on CBC Gem. That's our free app. And it's also where you can find other CBC programs. CBC Vancouver, also on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. The discovery of hundreds of Indigenous children's remains near Kamloops is having ripple effects across Canada. Next, we take you to Manitoba and look at the fallout there. Thanks for staying with us during our commercial-free live stream. Well, thousands of hopeful drivers in the Greater Toronto area have been sitting idle since road test centers closed during the pandemic. People say not having their full license is not only inconvenient, it's affecting their families and jobs. And as Angelina King reports, they may have to keep waiting for quite a while.
Even though Vishwa Patne has her driver's license in Dubai, cycling is her main source of transportation here.
I feel super helpless because I know I can drive a car really well.
Patne still has to pass a road test in Ontario to get her G2 license. Hers has been cancelled and rescheduled several times. Without her G2, she's had to turn down work.
I felt pretty hopeless because I was like, oh, I'm getting a job offer, which is pretty good. It pays me well, but I'm not able to take it up.
Ontario's Transportation Ministry says nearly 400,000 road tests have been cancelled during the pandemic, the majority in the GTA. At the same time, driving instructors could hardly operate.
Yes, I can do parallel parking. When you are approaching the vehicle,
Azar Malik has been creating instructional videos on social media since he can't teach in person. Malik says in a regular year, upwards of 800 students from his driving school would get their license. But during the pandemic, that was cut down to about 80. He's frustrated driving exams will start again during the province's first step of reopening, but driving instruction cannot.
Really doesn't make sense, because driving tests, obviously, the examiner sits in the passenger seat like an instructor as well, right? So I don't know what's the difference between instruction and examination.
Megan D is the only person in her family with any sort of license. She wants her G2 so she can drive her mom to work, who commutes for more than an hour. Plus, she wants to get flexible and pandemic-safe work as a courier to pay for nursing school.
It's just impending doom, Oh gosh, I'm so worried. I've been jobless since February.
Potney and Dee have road tests booked in July and August, but Malik says other students aren't as lucky. They're up against a testing backlog he's afraid won't be cleared until next year.
The unfortunate part is there's so many people out there who are disobeying the law now because they want to drive. They're driving alone with their G1s.
Back in January, the province said it'll be adding 84 new road test examiners to help address that backlog. So far, just 35 have been hired. Angelina King, CBC News, Toronto.
You're watching a live debate in the House of Commons tonight. This is what is called a take note debate tonight as they mark the discovery of the remains of more than 200 children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Prime Minister called the horrifying find, quote, the fault of Canada. Opposition parties are calling on the government to take urgent action. Now, at the sites of former residential schools across the country, it's a search some are calling for other children who never made it home. Cameron McIntosh reports.
Off the Trans-Canada Highway, that eagle stands in silent tribute to those who survived and those who did not.
That whole area needs to be taken a look at.
The Portage la Prairie Residential School sits upon what is now Long Plain First Nations Kishkimakwa Urban Reserve, a National Historic Site, one of the few places where a residential school building still stands intact. But it doesn't tell the whole story.
Over here, these spruce trees, are some, suspicion there might be.
Dennis Meaches is chief.
There's always been that sense that there were unmarked graves, and it's a crime scene.
So far, radar scans haven't found a grave here. Meaches is determined to have the entire area examined.
We'd like to do more work and research in that particular area, and have the land, of course, cleared of any unmarked graves.
An hour west, there's no wondering. Sioux Valley First Nation has evidence of unmarked remains near what was once the Brandon Residential School.
Our investigation has identified 104 potential graves.
Only 78 show up in official records. Among those unaccounted for, Jennifer Rattray's great aunt and uncle.
This is clearly wrong, and we need to fix this.
Over a century, more than 4,100 students are known to have died in residential schools.
Those children are our relatives and our elders and survivors.
Stephanie Scott for the Center for Truth and Reconciliation says their research shows churches and government bickered over costs of returning dead children.
So they ended up in paupers' graves, unmarked, unknown.
Ottawa says more than $30 million has been marked to help with research and searches. So far, very little of that money has actually been spent. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, Winnipeg.
The Catholic Church has tightened its internal laws, adding new offenses to deal with sexual misconduct committed by priests and others. Megan Williams explains what that means.
3 new crimes are included in this revision, this update of the Vatican canon law. The first is the recognition that adults can be victims of sexual abuse, so it's criminalizing the abuse by priests of adults as well. It also makes it a crime to groom children sexually, specifically by showing them pornography. And it puts non-clergy, so ordinary people who work for the Catholic Church, are now held responsible under canon law as well. So those are 3 specific new laws that have been introduced, but there's also been a tightening of language. There has been a lot of criticism over the years by Catholics and even those inside the Vatican about the fact that the language around the responsibility of bishops in particular for covering up laws has been loose, and that this has allowed bishops who are facing accusations to have rather charitable judgments against them. So with this tightening up of language, it makes it very clear that bishops are responsible for investigating any kind of accusation, and that if they don't, they will have to pay a price. Megan Williams, CBC News, the Vatican.
The church is also facing calls for accountability after the discovery of the remains of 215 Indigenous children at the site of former residential school in Kamloops. For some, the story has turned the focus back on the architects of the residential school system itself. As Aaron Collins shows us, battles are happening now to strip their names from structures across Canada.
Change is in the air at this Calgary junior high, the flag at half-mast in memory of children found buried at the site of a former residential school in Kamloops. Orange shirts worn to promote awareness of those schools, easy to see, replacing ones bearing the name of Hector Louis Langevin. Langevin, one of the creators of the residential school system, and until today, the person this school was named after.
We need to support our Indigenous community and try and right our past wrongs.
It took 4 years for these students to get the name changed to Riverside.
And I think it is our job as settlers to amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples because they have been oppressed for like hundreds of years.
Langevin's name was removed from this nearby bridge too. It's now known as Reconciliation Bridge.
So things are moving forward, and that's a good thing, only because things were so bad before that, movement is good.
Across Canada, the architects of the residential school system are easy to find, too easy for many. Names etched on statues, schools, and signs that many would like erased. Nowhere is that push more evident than in the birthplace of Confederation. A statue of Canada's first Prime Minister no longer welcome, moved due to Sir John A. Macdonald's role in creating residential schools.
It's a story that we've known in our communities across Canada of the atrocities and the genocidal effect that the residential schools have had on our communities.
Back in Calgary, that name change carries weight.
It does take allies for us to dismantle these systems, and so to have the parents and their children be involved with this is very important.
Hope that talk of change for Canada's First Nations may finally be more than just words. Aaron Collins, CBC News, Calgary.
After the break, fueling a call for action. Coming up, we speak to a commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How many more remains of Indigenous children could be found?
A new work week dawned in British Columbia with labor and government at each other's throats. Pickets were scattered along streets in cities and towns. The strained voice of thousands of unionized workers protesting the province's proposed labor legislation.
We'll never give up. We'll never give up.
Is this a picket line?
Yes, this is a picket line.
The Premier chose instead to cross a picket line that he calls illegal.
What is it really that everyone's objecting to?
We're never going to accept this bill, you know that. And you have the power, you have the legislative power to ram it down our throats. We know that too. But what? That's no goddamn good for the province.
The same argument has simmered here for 2 months, finally boiling over into a general strike aimed at shutting down the province.
They're very bitter, they're very upset. I think that's quite evident by what's been going on in the past few months.
Government offices were closed, school called off, and ferries docked, leaving travelers stranded.
Oh, for heaven's sakes, what in the world are we going to do?
And that's something. We drive all the way from Montana, and here we sit.
Excuse me. Hospitals only handled emergencies, and buses didn't run.
I think it's disgusting. It's disgraceful.
In Victoria, one self-proclaimed renegade defied his union order.
I am going to get it from the union and the people I work with. I'm going to be a scab, I'm going to be mud, but everybody has to have the courage of their convictions.
Findings of contempt.
This afternoon, the government followed through on some of its own convictions by seeking an injunction to end further protests.
The union leaders are trying to move the making of our laws out of the legislature and into the streets.
The injunction would stop union job action, including work slowdowns, study sessions, or general strikes, as a way to protest government legislation. Union leaders are livid.
I mean, it's just outrageous that the Attorney General of the province would be conducting his own, business such as this, making charges of criminal activity through the media without going through the proper channels.
This strike has done more than cost the province millions of dollars. It's changed the course of this dispute. Now the courts are involved, and union leaders may face imprisonment for waging a battle that they say is their right to fight. Jane Chalmers, CBC News, Vancouver.
Here are some of the stories we're following tonight on CBC Vancouver News.
I know that British Columbians want to turn the page on our colonial past, and the path to a modern forest policy has no shortcuts. It's hard work as we blaze a trail for generations to come.
The BC government is planning to redistribute forest tenures to Indigenous nations and small operators. Currently, 5 large companies hold roughly half the forest tenures in the province.
Did you see or hear anything out of the ordinary? Do you know something? Anything?
The family of a woman found dead after disappearing from her Port Moody home is offering a $50,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest and charges in the investigation. Trina Hunt's loved ones say they need closure and they know someone has information. Hunt was reported missing on January 18th. Her remains were found in a rural area in Hope on March 29th. The memorials are growing across the country after the discovery of the remains of 215 children at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. Since the find, there's been a number of calls for accountability beyond symbolic gestures, but calls to action have been demanded for years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission outlined its recommendations on missing children and burials, including a registry of deaths, site searches, and the repatriation of remains. At the core of this, although, is how so much of the history of residential schools is still left unknown and unaccounted for. In the last few days, we've seen several politicians pledge to help to make things right. Joining me now is Marie Wilson, who served for 6 years as a commissioner for the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thanks for joining us, Marie.
Glad to be here.
Now, the site near Kamloops is just one site out of more than 130 residential schools across Canada. More than 150,000 children placed in these institutions since the late 1800s. So these findings could be just the tip of the iceberg. How many more can the country expect to find?
Well, I think perhaps first to remind ourselves of how many children we already know died in residential schools. And as was included in our report, we had confirmed 3,200 children who did not return from the schools and another 1,000 approximately who died within a year of leaving the school, many of them sent home sick. And so we already knew for sure of about 4,200 children. This is about children who have been identified as buried in places that we have not yet had recorded or reported or reflected in the records that were made available to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission while we were standing, or subsequently to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So how many more can we expect? Who knows? We do know that everywhere in the country that we held hearings, we heard of instances where children talked about classmates who had disappeared, or incidents of extreme violence that they had witnessed, where a child would be taken out physically harmed and never seen again. We did hear of some cases of suicide among children. We did hear as well of children who talked about not only that there were burials on the school sites and cemeteries beside some of the schools, but some of them as children being called upon to help dig graves and to help bury what had been former classmates. So how many, we don't know for sure. And this is why paying attention to this, and this a recent, I'll call it a reawakening, because anyone who has been paying attention to this over the past decade knows that this is not new information, this particular finding.
When you talked about the stories of people who attended these residential schools or their ancestors who attended, and they knew that, you know, people went missing, their friends went missing. And when this happened, when this was discovered, we heard that. It wasn't a surprise for a lot of people in the Indigenous community, but then it was a shock and surprise for a lot of other people across North America. So why is there such a lack of information out there for everyone?
I think the issue is not, is there a lack of information? I think the issue is there a lack of paying attention? And is there a lack of proper care and concern and regard? Because the oral history that we accumulated, 7,000 statements, an unprecedented canvas of opinion and of factual information, bigger than any other in the history of the country of Indigenous peoples. And somehow we manage not to pay enough attention to all of that information. And why have we not taken as truth what survivors have told us to be their truths? It's as if we have to actually see the little bodies for ourselves before we can possibly believe that it is truthful. And I think that is a huge introspective question for us to ask ourselves as a society.
Absolutely. Now, there are also many questions and calls, rather, for the sites of other residential schools to be examined. The federal and provincial governments are vowing to do something. Do you think the efforts are sincere?
I think they're sincere, but I think they're slow. And when we three commissioners, myself and my two colleagues, issued a joint statement on December 15th of last year, the thing that we stressed above all else was the urgency of the calls to action that we articulated. The urgency, why? One, because just in terms of the presence of our living experts, who are the residential school survivors, they are now increasingly elderly, and we are losing them every week. There's not a one of us who has not lost survivor friends in the past week or days or month. So we're losing that expertise. That's the one thing. But the more important thing, the moral question, the ethical question for our country is, how seriously and how much to heart do we take this?
Marie Wilson, thank you so much for your time today and for being on the show, sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much.
That story can bring back traumatic memories or feelings of loss, sadness, or anger. There is help available. You can reach the 24-hour Indian Residential School Survivor Society crisis line at 1-866-925-4419. The KUAS crisis line is another option for adults and for youth. That information is also on our website, cbc.ca/BC. It's a massacre that's been long forgotten, but no more. A rampage through Black-owned businesses that killed hundreds is being remembered today. We take you to Tulsa next. And at 6:43, a live look at the gorgeous Long Beach in Tofino tonight. After the break, Johanna is here, and she's going to be using a word we don't use often in the Lower Mainland, muggy. U.S. President Joe Biden was in Oklahoma today to commemorate the 100th anniversary of what's known as the Tulsa massacre, an assault that killed hundreds of black men, women, and children. As Jessica Gallagher reports, the ceremonies mark a difficult chapter in the country's history.
100 years ago, a 19-year-old black man was threatened with lynching for allegedly assaulting a white woman in Tulsa. Blacks came to assist and fights ensued. As a result, local law enforcement deputized whites who descended on the African-American neighborhood of Greenwood, otherwise known as Black Wall Street. With the help of the National Guard, bombs were reportedly dropped. More than 1,600 businesses were burned to the ground, houses were looted, and 35 square blocks were destroyed. Hundreds were killed. There are only 3 known survivors remaining, ranging in age from 100 to 107. Viola Ford Fletcher is the oldest. She still sleeps with all of her lights on.
I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot.
No one has ever been held accountable. In an attempt to draw attention to the worst racial violence in America since the end of slavery, President Joe Biden declared May 31st, 2021, a day of remembrance. The president also met with survivors and their families in a show of support.
We do ourselves no favors by pretending none of this ever happened, or it doesn't impact us today, because it does still impact us today. We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do.
Dozens of events have been held here, including a candlelight vigil, church services, and the unveiling of a prayer wall. Mass graves possibly related to the massacre are in the process of being exhumed today. Jessica Gallagher for CBC News, Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe is back with the forecast. Joe, I see in the corner there a little bright plastic thing.
Yep, that right there, Anita. I think these are my evening plans. See if I can show you my evening plans, tomorrow's morning plans, and basically right through until Thursday plans. Did you get your kiddie pool set up for yours?
I did this morning, and I got some pictures of Anya splashing about today in the afternoon. So I'm loving the kiddie pool. I think I need to go in myself.
I think so too. That's my plan too. I got the drink ready, Anita.
Perfect. Okay, so this heat is obviously perfect weather for the kiddie pool, but it will come to an end. That's perhaps a good thing, but when is that happening?
Yes, you're right. By the time we hit the weekend, it's unfortunate timing, but we will need the rain by then. Let me show you the forecast across the province. If anyone else was on the fence about getting their pools out or, fans, because we are talking some hot weather right across the province, I would do it. We've got one more very hot day. And even Thursday and Friday, as our ridge breaks down, things are still looking hot. Now, I just wanted to show you this map I've taken from Environment Canada. This is the heat warning criteria across the country. Notice what a patchwork it is. The criteria for heat warning is different almost everywhere across Canada. And for Metro Vancouver, we're not quite hitting that heat criteria, which is why it has not been issued. But I just thought it was so interesting as Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba issue heat warnings today. We're not seeing the peak of the heat here in Metro. We're not seeing the warning criteria anyway. High pressure is going to continue to shift eastward. It's still hot and muggy. We'll see a bit more cloud cover by tomorrow night, perhaps some showers for northern Vancouver Island, but we will stay dry across Metro Vancouver and in fact across most of Metro Vancouver. There's a look at that forecast again for tomorrow. Hot and muggy for one more day. Temperatures in the southern Okanagan could hit the high 30s for Wednesday. Notice as we head into Thursday, coming down a little bit, but still quite warm as that ridge tracks across the prairies. And yes, really hot is the word I'm using to describe as it punches into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba for the week ahead. And right on schedule as we head into the weekend, look at that cool down. Just 16s for Saturday and Sunday with showers in the forecast. It's looking like much more seasonal springtime by the weekend. But speaking of things heating up, I wanted to tell you about a new report by some of the world's top meteorologists that has just come out. And they've issued a warning saying that the chances of the planet continuing to warm in the next few years has increased. I spoke with an expert about what this means for Canada.
We know that Earth is heating up, but according to a new release from the World Meteorological Organization, we could push past limits set by the 2015 Paris Climate Accord a lot faster than we thought. Every year, the WMO releases these new projections for what the decades ahead will look like based on new data and tighter modeling. And the forecast is looking dire. There's a 40% chance Earth will be hotter than the Paris target of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius within 5 years. That's up from the 20% chance last year. And there's a 90% chance that the world will set yet another record for hottest year by the end of 2025. Just a reminder of what those targets are set in the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. 2 records, actually, or 2 goals. One, to stay below 2 degrees of warming since pre-industrial times, with a more stringent goal of keeping it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Basically, island nations and developing countries saw that 2-degree goal and said, we need to aim for 1.5. We're already seeing the worst of climate change. And keep in mind, the world has already warmed over 1 degree Celsius. And for Canada, the forecast could be even more dire.
Canada's warming at roughly twice the global rate, part of us being a large, northern country. And so that means, around 1.5 degrees of warming globally actually means 3 degrees of warming here in Canada. And in fact, even more warming in winter on average. And so, if we stay on the current climate trajectory, Canada's going to be a very unrecognizable place.
Hitting that threshold is very likely over the years to come, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will be our new average. Variability year to year means we might hit it, but it won't be until the 2040s that it actually becomes Earth's new average, which means there's still time to adapt and prevent the worst. Johanna Wagstaffe, CBC News, Vancouver.
It's a hockey wager in a small town with some big consequences. What happened in Rankin Inlet when the Habs beat the Leafs next.
Over. Swimmer.
This could be deadly. A paddler clinging to a kayak in cold water.
All right, Karen? I think I'm pretty good. Okay.
But what's happening here is on purpose. A well-practiced pair performing a water rescue, something that they say anyone paddling this summer should be comfortable with. The Windsor-Essex County Canoe Club has been around for decades, and this year, interest is at an all-time high.
The numbers of new people are astronomical. I remember when we started, you almost knew everybody that you drove by with a kayak.
Windsor police say they're also seeing more people on the water. Longtime paddlers love to see it and want first-timers to know some basic safety skills after hearing about an increase in rescues. First step is the kayak. Recreational pelicans are popular entry-level options.
That's what I started in. They're good for ponds, they're good for creeks, anywhere that they can get to shore on their own and not have to worry about getting back into the boat.
Next, a life jacket. Pay attention to the fit and wear it whenever you're on the water. You also need a safety kit in case things go wrong.
We have a pump to pump the water out of our boat up here on the deck. The rope, a signaling device, which I have a whistle here somewhere tucked in.
And you can buy a cheap kit from Canadian Tire if you don't want to buy anything too fancy. And that will give you the bare minimum.
Something harder to find, but available through clubs like these, a paddle partner.
If you're fairly new, you should never paddle alone, because if you have a buddy with you, between the two of you, you can get back in the boat.
Anyone paddling in Windsor has eyes for Pesh Island. For that, they strongly suggest a boat with a bulkhead.
This is sectioned off from the rest of the boat, so this entire back half is air, and the front half is air. So the only part that can fill up is just 4 inches of water in there, maybe.
We set off.
Thanks for the start there.
Okay, first thing, paddles upside down.
See, we're learning together.
angling ourselves upriver.
Now, you two are the strong paddlers, just in case you were wondering. Will keep me in the middle.
The conditions, they're rougher than you might expect from land. This is where trouble can happen fast. Police boats rushed to a pair of rescues this month, finding one kayaker in water that was near freezing temperatures, his partner trying to rescue him onto their kayak. Then another pair of capsized kayakers this weekend. It's why these experienced paddlers stress traveling in groups and practicing pulling someone out of the water in safe conditions.
So he's pulling it up. He would dump any water out that's in it. These guide wires are important because if it was really choppy or windy, I would need those to keep in touch, in contact with him and the boat.
And that's also what I used to grab her boat with, so that she can't flip. And there. So I'm in pretty quick.
Hi, I'm Amy Bell, and here's what's in your CBC Vancouver inbox.
From June 1st to July 1st, join the Talking Stick Festival around the bright fire of summer sojourn. See vibrant Indigenous performance, art, film, and more. Learn more at fullcircle.ca. And on June 23rd, join CBC Vancouver's Anita Bathe for UBC Dialogue's latest conversation, Medical Innovations. Where is technology leading us? Get your tickets at alumni.ubc.ca.
A unique hockey bet has become the talk of the town in Ranked Inlet, Nunavut.
Two diehard fans, one Leafs, one Habs, said whoever's team lost the game had to go fishing.
Right after the game, I got my fishing equipment ready.
So that's what you're seeing right here. The Leafs fan making good on the bet. The two say the whole community came out to watch what was going on in the middle of the lake. The wrinkle in this bet, you're probably wondering, because it just looks like they're fishing. Well, the pond has no fish, none whatsoever. But you know what? It looks like a gorgeous day. I wouldn't complain about being on the pond. No fish, sure, it is what it is.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I think they made the most of it. What a rivalry for the ages, though. I've seen some hilarious bets, but that may be one of my favorite, Anita.
For sure. All right, that is it for our show tonight. You can always find our program online, cbc.ca/BC. Your next local news is right here at 11 o'clock after the National with Dan Burrett. Good night.
Good night.